Nothing was wasted, not because people were merely virtuous, but because the environment allowed no mistakes. On the American frontier, discipline was not a moral value. It was an immediate response to reality. If something remained, it needed a purpose. If something was thrown away, someone would pay for it later. With hunger, with cold, or with loss. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote that on the frontier, the environment was stronger than man. Either he accepted the imposed conditions or he disappeared. Early American pioneers didn't choose an easy life. They chose necessity. The frontier wasn't landscape, it was absolute isolation. This appears repeatedly in 19th century records. In the book, On the Oregon Trail, the author describes the journey without romance. Our supplies were never enough. Each day was a calculation of what could be spared and what could not. Nothing came easy. Nothing arrived fast. A family heading west packed everything they owned into a single wagon, 12 feet long, 4 feet wide. That wagon carried tools for building a home that didn't exist yet, seeds for crops they'd never planted, clothes for seasons they hadn't experienced. Most families brought 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 20 pounds of coffee if they were lucky, a few pounds of sugar, salt, beans, rice. That was it. The journey from Missouri to Oregon was over 2,000 miles, on foot, moving at 2 miles per hour on good days. There were no supply stations, no rest stops, no turning back. If you ran out of food halfway, you hunted. If you couldn't hunt, you starved. If the wagon broke, you fixed it with whatever you had, or you abandoned it. In one diary entry from 1846, a man writes, "We passed 3 abandoned wagons today. Their owners took what they could carry and walked. We did not stop to help. We could barely help ourselves." A single mistake, one moment of carelessness, could end everything. Food as logistics. In the diaries, food doesn't appear as pleasure. It appears as a mathematical problem. In Letters of a Woman Homesteader, Eleanor Pruitt Stewart writes,
"We do not cook to taste, we cook to last. Heavy bread, made not to spoil.
Thin broths thickened with scraps. Bones boiled more than once. Nothing was thrown away because nothing could be replaced. Eating more than necessary today meant hunger tomorrow." This wasn't said in a moral tone. It was understood as physical law. One pioneer woman recorded her weekly routine.
Monday, bake bread. Tuesday, render fat. Wednesday, preserve what remains. Thursday, begin again.
There was no variety, no experimentation, no room for failure. Meals were built around one question: will this keep us alive until next week? The animal. Nothing was wasted. The total use of an animal was not merely cultural tradition, it was raw necessity. In a diary from the Oregon Trail in 1852, a traveler records, "When the ox fell, every part was claimed. Meat, hide, fat, bones, all were spoken for before nightfall. There was no waste because there was no excess. The meat fed the family, fresh at first, then salted and dried into jerky, capable of lasting for months. The fat became reserve fuel for cooking, and later, candles, slowly rendered over fire until it became pure tallow, stored in jars, carefully rationed through the winter. The hide became shelter, then shoes, then rope, then patches for the wagon cover. The bones were boiled into broth, then boiled again, then boiled a third time until they crumbled. After that, they were dried and carved into tools, buttons, needles, handles. Even the sinew was saved, used as thread, as binding for broken tools, as cord for improvised repairs. The hooves were boiled down into glue. The organs that could not be eaten were used as bait for traps. The blood was mixed with fat to form a dense, calorie-rich cake, capable of sustaining someone through heavy labor. There was no concept of trash. Almost everything had a use. In another diary, a woman writes,
We do not throw away what is broken. We break it down further until it becomes something else.
Every object had a life cycle that extended far beyond its original function. And when it could no longer serve, it was burned for heat. Even the ash had a purpose, mixed with water to make lye, used in soap making. Nothing ended, it only transformed. The ancient theme, discipline. The lives of the pioneers were, without a doubt, hard, and one of the most important elements was the repetition of discipline. Every day, without pause, without exception. In Pioneer Girl, Laura Ingalls Wilder describes her childhood without softening anything.
We learned early not to ask for more. There was no more.
Discipline went far beyond food. It shaped how children worked, how families organized their days, how every action was calculated in terms of survival. A child's day on the frontier began before sunrise, not because parents were strict, but because everyone had to cooperate for the household to function. Animals had to be fed, water had to be hauled, fires had to be lit. And if those things didn't happen, the family didn't eat. One settler wrote about his 7-year-old son. He tends the chickens, hauls water twice a day, and splits kindling before breakfast. He does not complain. He knows what happens if he fails. Children didn't learn responsibility through speeches. They learned it through consequences. If you forgot to latch the chicken coop, a fox got in and you went without eggs for weeks. If you left tools in the rain, they rusted, and there was no way to fix the plow when it broke. If you didn't stack firewood properly, it got wet, and there would be no heat when winter came. Carelessness had a cost, immediate cost. Another diary entry from a mother in Kansas, 1870.
I do not scold my children for hunger, but I do not tolerate carelessness.
Hunger was sometimes inevitable. Carelessness was not. Women faced the same relentless structure. A typical day for a frontier wife? Wake at 4:30 a.m., start the fire. Make breakfast from the previous day's leftovers. Feed the family. Clean. Tend the garden. Preserve whatever was ready to harvest. Mend clothes, always mending because new clothes did not exist. Prepare dinner. Feed the family again. Clean again. Prepare for the next day. Sleep. Repeat. Every day. For years. One woman described it plainly.
There is no day off. There is no version of tomorrow where the work is optional.
And if she got sick, the work still had to be done by someone, because bread doesn't bake itself. Gardens don't weed themselves. Children don't feed themselves. In a letter from 1878, a man writes about his wife. She gave birth to our daughter in the morning and made supper that same evening, not because she wanted to, but because there was no one else to do it. That wasn't heroism, it was structure. Men carried the same weight, building a home from nothing, clearing land by hand, trees felled with axes, stumps pulled with chains and oxen, plowing fields in soil so hard it broke metal blades, constantly repairing everything, fences, roofs, tools, wagons. From a farmer's journal in Nebraska, 1880. I work from dawn until I can no longer see. Then I work by firelight. There is always something broken, always something that must be done before tomorrow. There was very little margin. There was no second chance. If the harvest failed, you and your family went hungry. If the roof leaked and you didn't fix it, winter destroyed the house. If you lost your only saw, you couldn't build. And that's why they made few mistakes. Because the environment gave them no other option. Discipline was not taught, it was absorbed. Children watched their parents work until exhaustion, and then work more. They watched problems being solved with whatever was available. They watched nothing, absolutely nothing, go to waste. And they learned, this is what it takes to survive. One man wrote in his journal, "Discipline is not what we teach, it is what life demands." And life demanded it every single day, without mercy, without rest, without end. Medicine and death, when there was no doctor. When we read these diaries, one thing appears again and again. Death was always close. It was not seen only as tragedy, but as probability. There were no doctors on the frontier, no hospitals, no pharmacies. If you got sick, you treated yourself. If the treatment didn't work, you faced a very real risk of dying. It was that simple. In a letter from 1871, a woman writes,
My daughter developed a fever on Tuesday. By Friday, she could no longer stand. On Sunday, we buried her. She was 6 years old.
No drama. That was simply reality. Child mortality was so common that many families did not name their children until they survived their first year. One mother wrote,
I gave birth to 9 children. 5 lived past the age of 2. This is not unusual.
An infection from a small cut could kill you. Childbirth frequently killed mothers. A broken bone that failed to heal properly could cripple someone for life. Pioneers relied on what they had: willow bark tea for pain and fever, honey to treat wounds, whiskey for disinfection, and a great deal of courage. Poultices made from mud, herbs, or whatever was available. One settler described treating his son's infected hand. I packed the wound with crushed yarrow and wrapped it in boiled cloth. Then I prayed. That is all a father can do out here. Sometimes it worked. Many times, it didn't. A doctor's journal from the 1880s describes visits to frontier families. I arrive too late most of the time. They wait until the patient is beyond saving before calling for help, if help can even reach them. Distance kills as surely as disease. Because even if a doctor existed 50 miles away, reaching him took days, and days were often too long. Women learned to deliver babies on their own, or with the help of a neighbor who had done it before. No anesthesia, no sterilization, no medical training, only experience and necessity. One midwife recorded her methods.
I boil everything I can. I scrub my hands raw. I pray over the mother. Sometimes she lives, sometimes she doesn't. I have learned not to promise anything.
Grief was real, but it could not stop life. Because survival required continuation. You buried your dead in the morning, and you worked in the afternoon. Not because you didn't care, but because stopping meant more death. One father wrote after losing his wife, I have 3 children who still need feeding. I do not have time to mourn as I should. I will grieve when winter comes and the work slows. Until then, I must be both mother and father. This created a different relationship with death. Not exactly acceptance, but realism, and a deep spiritual grounding in these men and women. You did everything you could. Growths, migration, and physical effort. There were no roads waiting for the pioneers. They did not travel on roads. They created them. By walking, by dragging wagons, by wearing down the earth with thousands of footsteps until the ground became a path. Indigenous trails, used for centuries, became the first routes west. Narrow paths made for people on foot were widened by wagons, trampled by oxen, cut deeper and deeper into the land with every passing family. The Wilderness Road, opened by Daniel Boone in 1775, was not built, it was walked into existence. From Virginia through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, over 200 miles of raw terrain, no bridges, no clearing crews, just Boone and a small group cutting through dense forests with axes. They marked trees, cleared brush, left a trail barely wide enough for a horse. Within a few years, more than 200,000 people had followed that trail west. Their feet and wagons turned Boone's narrow path into a road. But calling it a road is generous. A traveler in 1795 described it this way: "The road is little more than mud and roots. In places, the wagon sinks to the axle. We cut logs and lay them across the worst sections just to move forward." This technique, called a corduroy road, was common. Logs laid side by side across swampy ground. Nothing engineered, just placed there. It worked, badly. Wagons bounced violently over the uneven surface. Goods were damaged, bones were bruised, but it was better than being stuck. The National Road, later called the Cumberland Road, was one of the first federally funded highways. Construction began in 1811. It stretched from Maryland to Illinois, more than 600 miles. But even this official road was primitive by modern standards. A report from 1825 described the conditions. "The road is passable in summer. In spring and fall, it becomes a river of mud. Wagons are frequently abandoned when they sink too deep to recover." Travel was not measured in miles per hour. It was measured in miles per day. On a good day, 15 miles. On a bad day, 5 miles. On the worst days, 0. You waited for the mud to dry, for the river to drop, for the storm to pass. And if winter came early, you stopped completely, because winter travel was suicide unless the ground froze solid. Then ice became infrastructure. Rivers that were impassable in summer became roads in winter. Wagons crossed on thick ice. Supplies were hauled while the ground was hard. One pioneer wrote, "We wait for the freeze. Only then can we move heavy loads. The cold is our ally." But timing was everything. Too early and the ice was too thin. Too late and the thaw trapped you. People drowned when the ice gave way beneath them. Entire wagon trains were lost. Every mile west was paid for with physical effort. Not just walking, hauling, pushing, pulling. When wagons got stuck, and they always did, everyone pushed. Men, women, children. Unloading cargo to lighten the load. Digging out wheels with bare hands. Laying planks, rocks, anything for traction. A man wrote in his journal in 1843, "We have pushed the wagon out of the mud 11 times today. My hands bleed. My back refuses to straighten. We made 4 miles. 4 miles. For a full day of agony. The mountains were worse. Wagons had to be taken apart and carried piece by piece, or lowered down steep slopes with ropes. One wrong move and everything, wagon, supplies, family, fell into a ravine." A woman described crossing the Rocky Mountains in 1849.
We tied ropes to the wagon and lowered it inch by inch. The men held the ropes. If they slipped, we lost everything. My husband's hands were raw and bleeding by nightfall, but the wagon made it down.
There was no choice, no alternate route, no easy way, only the mountain, and the work required to cross it. Rivers had to be forded, no bridges, no ferries in most places. You drove the wagon into the water and hoped. Hoped the current wasn't too strong. Hoped the riverbed wasn't too soft. Hoped the water didn't rise above the wagon bed and ruin the flour. Countless families lost everything in river crossings. Wagons overturned. Supplies were swept away. People drowned. A diary entry from the Oregon Trail, 1852. The river took the Johnson family's wagon. They lost 2 children and all their food. We gave them what little we could spare. It was not much. Every mile forward was earned, not driven, not traveled, earned, through exhaustion, through pain, through the brutal repetition of effort. There were no shortcuts. The path was the work. The human cost, conflict on the frontier. The frontier was not empty land. It was already inhabited by nations that had lived there for thousands of years. And the collision between two completely different cultures was inevitable, violent, and tragic for both sides. Westward expansion was not only about courage and hardship, it was also about constant conflict. Sometimes it began with broken treaties. Sometimes it began with violence from settlers encroaching on native lands. Sometimes it began with raids by warrior cultures defending their territory. The truth is, both sides fought, both sides killed, both sides suffered. In many cases, the United States government made treaties with no intention of honoring them. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced entire nations off their land. The Trail of Tears displaced approximately 100,000 people. Around 15,000 died during the forced marches. A missionary traveling with the Cherokee wrote,
"I saw elderly people collapse and be left behind because the march did not stop."
But the violence was not one-sided. On the Great Plains, the Comanche and Apache nations were feared by settlers and by other tribes for their fierce warrior traditions. Raids on settlements were common, brutal. Families were killed. Women and children were taken captive. Livestock was stolen. A settler in Texas in 1836 wrote, "We found the Johnson family's homestead burned. The bodies were mutilated. The children were gone. This is the third raid this month." For the Comanche, this was war. War to defend hunting grounds. War to resist invasion. War conducted according to the rules of their culture, which included taking captives and instilling terror in enemies. The same tactics European armies had used for centuries. The conflict intensified when both sides refused to give ground. The United States government wanted total control of the land. Native nations wanted to remain sovereign on their ancestral territories. There was no middle ground both could accept. Negotiations frequently failed, not always because of bad faith, but because the goals were fundamentally incompatible. A treaty council in 1867 illustrates this. A U.S. negotiator offered reservation land and annual payments. A Kiowa chief responded,
"You want us to live like white men. We do not want to live like white men. We want to live as we have always lived, free to hunt, free to move. You ask us to give up everything. We ask you to leave us alone."
Neither side could give the other what it wanted, and so the violence continued. The Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. U.S. troops killed more than 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women, children, and the elderly. The village was flying a white flag. It did not matter. The Fetterman Fight, 1866. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors killed 81 U.S. soldiers in a carefully planned ambush. There were no survivors. Both sides committed atrocities. In the 1870s, the U.S. Army adopted a strategy of total war. Destroy the buffalo herds, starve the Plains nations into surrender. The bison population fell from 30 million to fewer than 1,000. One general stated openly, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." And it worked. Starvation forced surrender. On December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek, more than 250 Lakota men, women, and children were killed by U.S. troops. Many were shot while fleeing. Wounded Knee marked the end, not because one side was right and the other wrong, but because one side had the industrial capacity to win and the other did not. This is part of the story, a hard part, a necessary part. The frontiers shaped American resilience. The end of the frontier. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau made an official declaration.
There is no longer a frontier line. The unsettled area has been so broken up by isolated bodies of settlement that it can hardly be said that a frontier line still exists.
The frontier was over. After nearly 300 years of westward expansion, the continent had been crossed. From the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 to the official closure in 1890, 87 years of constant migration. Millions of people moved west. Entire cities were built from nothing. Indigenous nations were displaced or destroyed. The landscape was fundamentally transformed. By 1890, the United States had 45 states, a transcontinental railroad, telegraph lines connecting both coasts, a population of 63 million people. The nation that had once been a narrow strip of colonies along the Atlantic now stretched from ocean to ocean. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner recognized what this meant. In 1893, he argued that the frontier had shaped the American character. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain the development of the United States. Self-reliance, practicality, the ability to solve problems without outside help. Whether Turner was entirely right is debatable, but what is not debatable is this. For generations, people lived under specific conditions: isolation, scarcity, distance from authority. Those conditions undeniably shaped behavior. The cost was enormous. An estimated 15,000 people died during the Trail of Tears alone. Tens of thousands were killed in conflicts. Countless others died from disease, accidents, and starvation. The buffalo population was reduced from 30 million to near extinction. The frontier shaped the nation through material reality, the way people ate, the way they built their things, and above all, the way they survived. When the census declared the frontier closed, those habits did not disappear. They persisted for generations. The children of homesteaders became the parents of the Great Depression generation. Those values, fix what breaks, waste nothing, endure, carried forward. The frontier ended in 1890, but what it taught remained, written in diaries, in letters, in the plain records of those who survived it. When you have nothing, you make do. When you have something, you make it last. When life is uncertain, you keep moving anyway. The frontier closed, but the lessons did not.